So it's official. 2020 marks the 21st year that capital punishment is no longer on the books in Canada. Now, we're seeing in recent weeks, under the last vestiges of the Trump administration, there's been a lot of federal executions. The last woman on death row on the federal side is slated to be executed. But I want to go over, without what I call exploiting it, the history of Canada's capital punishment, the early years especially, because it shows the differences between the republic system of the States and the British Commonwealth system of Canada. So it's very complex now. Capital punishment in Canada dates back to Canada's earliest history, including its period as a partial French colony, and after 1763, its time as a British colony, which is part of the Commonwealth system of execution. Now, from 1867 to elimination of the death penalty for murder on July 26, 1976, 1,481 people have been sentenced to death, and 710 had been executed. Of these that was executed, 697 were men and 13 were women. The only method used in Canada for capital punishment of civilians after the end of the French regime was hanging, which is the normal Commonwealth process for execution. Now, the last execution in Canada was the botched double hanging of Arthur Lucas and Ronald Turpin on December 11, 1962 at the Toronto's Dunn Jail, which we'll get into in a future podcast. Now, also, the military used firing squad as the method of execution until 1999. Now, the death penalty was de facto abolished in Canada in January 1963 and de jure in September of 1999. In 1976, Bill C-84 was enacted, abolishing the death penalty for murder, treason, and piracy. Now, some service offenses under the National Defence Act continue to carry on a mandatory death sentence if committed traitorously, although no one was executed for that since 1945. Canada eliminated the death penalty for military offenses on September 1st, 1999. Now, the history of execution in Canada is very unique, and some gay activists are aware of this, but some people may not. The only reason why we had an executioner at the first in Canada was because of a homosexual act. Here it goes. The post of executioner in New France was briefly held by André Banal in 1645, but was not permanently occupied until 1648, when a military drummer stationed at the French garrison in Ville-Marie, New France, was sentenced to death for sodomy by local supplicant priests. After intervention by the Jesuits in Quebec City, the drummer's life was spared on the condition that he accept the position of New France's first permanent executioner. As only the drummer was placed on trial, the widespread consensus of many historians is that his sexual partner may have been a First Nations man who was not subject to French religious law. The drummer's real name was never ever confirmed in historical records. However, in his 2006 book, Répression de homosexuels au Québec et en France, historian Patrice Corriveau identified the drummer as René Rouget de Tambour, although other historians have challenged this identification, as no known historical records placed a person of that name in New France any earlier than 1680. Now, if I'm not mistaken, because the French drummer may have been the top of the situation, he was charged and slated to be executed. But if he was a bottom, I don't think he would have. I know that sounds bizarre, but under the rules at the time, the person that was using his genitals in the process of sodomy, if he was the top or the not the aggressor, but the situation, he would be charged. The receiver, in many cases, would not be charged. But it tied in also to homosexual acts years ago. If someone gave oral sex, he would be charged while the receiver would not be. But it's a weird system. Like I said, I'm not an expert on that. But that's what the facts tell us. Now, with the role of executioner being unpopular, it was common in New France that a male criminal who had been sentenced to death could have his life spared if he agreed to take the job of executing others, while a female prisoner could have her life spared if the executioner agreed to marry her. Similar cases including Jacques Degré, who was sentenced to death for theft in 1665, but managed to avoid being executed by agreeing to testify against and execute his associate, and John Corleri, who took the job in 1751 and simultaneously saved the life of a fellow prisoner, François Laurent, by marrying her. Now, in British North America in 1749, Peter Cartzel, a sailor aboard a ship in Halifax Harbor, stabbed Abraham Goodsides to death and wounded 2 other men. He was brought before a captain's court, where he was found guilty and sentenced to death. 2 days later, he was hanged from the yardarm of the vessel as a deterrent or deterrent to others. This is one of the earliest records of capital punishment in English-speaking Canada. It is difficult to accurately state numbers of capital punishment, since there were no systematic efforts to accurately record names, dates, and locations of executions until after 1867, when Canada was an official independent nation. Now, many records of these years, from 1749 to the current date of Confederation, or would not say current date of Confederation, but the announced Canadian country, have been lost because of fires, floods, or what they call paper decay. Now, after Confederation, a revision of the statutes reduced the number of offenses punishable by death to 3: murder, rape, and treason. In 1868, Parliament also stated that a location of execution was to be within the confines of the prison instead of public hangings. By the 1870s, however, the jails had begun to build the gallows 5 feet from the ground with a pit underneath instead of the previous high scaffold, the platform of which was level with the prison wall. Now, Robert Bickdyke was a businessman, politician, and social reformer who believed the abolition of capital punishment was an imperative and to some extent his life's mission. Few spoke as loudly as eloquently as he did for its reform. As an MP in 1914 and again in 1916, he introduced a bill to replace the death penalty with a life sentence. He opposed capital punishment on many grounds, considering an insult to Christianity and religion in general and a blot on any civilized nation. There is nothing, he stated in the House of Commons, more degrading to society at large than the death penalty. He also spoke of class disparities, pointing out that punishment was administered to the poor far more often than to the wealthy. He refuted the notion that state-sponsored killing acted as a deterrent to murder and cautioned against the possibility of mistake, which ties into what I think. I basically think capital punishment, if it has a 10% process of error, that's 10% too much. And again, the Stephen Truscott case. Now, in 1950, an attempt was made to abolish capital punishment. The Ross Thatcher, at the time a CCF, which is a precursor to NDP, a member of Parliament, moved Bill No. 2 in order to amend the criminal code to abolish the death penalty. Thatcher later withdrew it for fear of Bill No. 2 not generating positive discussion and further harming the chances of abolition. In 1956, the Joint Committee on the House and Senate recommend the retention of capital punishment as the mandatory punishment for murder, which opened the door to the possibility of abolition. In 1961, legislation was introduced to reclassify murder into capital and non-capital murder, which many believe was the first step towards abolition. This, of course, evolved in what we have now, first-degree and second-degree murder. A capital murder involving a planned or deliberate murder, murder during violent crimes, or the murder of an officer or prison guard were considered first-degree murder. Now, non-capital murder did not carry the death sentence, which is pretty well like manslaughter. Now, following the success of Pearson and the Liberal Party in the 1963 vote, and through the successive governments of Trudeau, the federal cabinet commuted all death sentences as a matter of policy. Hence, the de facto abolition of the death penalty in Canada occurred in 1963. It may have continued if Diefenbaker would have won the election, but in the 1960s, there was a process of revisionists across Canada, mostly of the Liberal Party, to form Canada's own laws without interference from the British, full style, would basically said, yes, we can take aspects of British law, but changes are needed. Now, on November 30th, 1967, Bill C-168 was passed, created a 5-year moratorium on the use of the death penalty, except for murders of police and corrections officers. On January 26, 1973, after expiration of the 5-year experiment, the Solicitor General of Canada continued a partial ban on capital punishment, would eventually lead to the abolition of capital punishment. On July 14, 1976, Bill C-84 was passed by a narrow margin of 130 to 124 in a free vote, resulting in the abolition of the death penalty for murder, treason, and piracy. It was given royal assent on July 16th and came into force July 26, 1976. Now, at the time, certain military offenses under the National Defence Act committed by members of the Canadian Armed Forces continued to carry the death penalty, which included cowardice, desertion, unlawful surrender, and spying for the enemy, with mandatory death penalty sentence if committed in the case of treason or traitorism. Bill C-25 replaced their penalty with life imprisonment, resulting in the de jure abolition of the death penalty, which came into force September 1st, 1999, although it received royal assent on December 10th, 1998. On June 30th, 1987, there was efforts to restore the death penalty, but it was defeated in the House of Commons in 148 to 127 vote, which was the government of Brian Mulroney. Now, in that tally, Mulroney, Minister of Justice Ray Natition, and Minister of External Affairs Joe Clark, the former leader of the Conservative Party, opposed the bill, whereas Deputy Prime Minister Don Macenkowski, the majority of PC MPs, supported it. Again, the big influence by the Liberal and NDP members against the death penalty. Now, first-degree murder, the new name of capital murder, now carries a mandatory life sentence without eligibility for parole until a person has served 25 years of the sentence. Now, the last execution in Canada were, again, Ronald Turpin and Arthur Lucas, convicted for separate murders at 12:02 a.m. on December 11th, 1962, at the Don Jail in Toronto. Now, we're going to go over this in a future podcast, but again, both executions were botched and one in a very dramatic way. Now, the last woman to be hanged in Canada was Margaret Pitt, which is a podcast on my channel here, on January 9th, 1953, for her part in the Albert Gay affair. Now, the last person sentenced to death in Canada was one Mario Gauthier on May 14, 1976, for the murder of a prison guard in Quebec. He was reprieved as capital punishment was abolished for all common crimes on July 14th the same year. Now, across Canada, Alberta, last execution, the controversial execution of Robert Raymond Cook from Fort Saskatchewan, November 15, 1960. In BC, Leo Manta of Okalala, April 28, 1959. Manitoba, Henry Malinik from Winnipeg, July 17, 1952. New Brunswick, my cousin Joe Richard, December 11, 1957. He's from Dalhousie but with roots in Benjamin and New Mills. May 22nd, 42. Herbert of Augustus Spratt from Newfoundland and Labrador, from St. John's. Northwest Territories, Fred Cardinal from Fort Smith, June 4th, 1954. Nova Scotia, Everett Farmer, December 15th, 37, from Shelburne. Nunavut, of course, was formed as a territory after the execution law was stricken. None. Ontario, of course, the Lucas and Turpin case in Toronto. PEI, Earl Lund and Frederick Phillips in Charlottetown, August 20th, 1949. Quebec, Ernest Côté, Montreal, March 11, 1960. Jacques Laurent, Regina, February 20th, 1946. In Yukon, Alexander Gogoff, Whitehurst, March 10th, 1916. Now, of course, military executions. During the First World War, 25 Canadian soldiers were executed. Most were shot for service offenses such as desertion and cowardice, but 2 executions were for murder. Now, that list is available via Wikipedia under a list of Canadian soldiers executed during World War I. Now, one Canadian soldier, which I've covered in my podcast channel before, Private Harold Pringle, was executed during the Second World War for murder. So, future podcasts, we'll be talking about the executions that were prominent at the time, the dual murder in Toronto, and the partly of the Truscott case. The Stephen Truscott case, for people that don't know, He was basically almost a preteen when he was put on death row as a teenager, and he was not guilty of the charge, but it was almost set for execution. That drew a lot of media and public interest, and was part of the process that stopped executions in Canada, because a lot of people believed that a child on death row was not reflective of the Canadian attitude of being a different type of country than the international ones would see no mercy. You know, Canada is a very merciful country, whether you like it or not. That's just the way we are. So listen, ladies and gentlemen, thanks for listening. Happy holiday week. And the reason why I'm doing these podcasts on executions across Canada, I've been, I think, fortunate to be part of the coverage of various criminal crimes in Northern New Brunswick and New Brunswick over the years. I've learned how to cover these unfortunate events with common decorum and respect to the families of the victims and the readers that must read. So just here as a public service. I'm not doing this to exploit my knowledge of murder in New Brunswick, because I come from a province where Alan Nagier and other famous murderers are still talked about on a regular basis. I believe every person deserves to be heard in a media forum, and I let the people, make the judgments. I'm not judging these people. It's just, it's provided as a public service, and we'll leave it at that. Have a good day. Bye.